Exploring some of the different Battletech ideas. In my opinion, one of the great things about Battletech is the scalability of the game. We can go in mech versus mech, game of armored combat, core rules, and we can get a great experience. And of course, we can play a big game, smaller game, depending on the battle value. But then we can start putting in total warfare, and we can bring in infantry, and we can bring in tanks. We can bring in artillery. We can explore different ideas of city fight, city tech, where buildings are static and that they really can't be destroyed. I mean, visually and narrative, they might take some damage, but they're there. Or you can play with the destruction rules where they're assigned a value and you can destroy things and interact with that way, different terrain effects. You can play with smoke. You can play with fire. The game can scale up and be complex, or it can be a little bit easier. And certainly wanting to get the most out of your mech collection, you start off with the base rules and then add things on. What I generally like to do, we kind of play with all the rules Total Warfare because we've been playing Battletech for so long. We, in theory, know most of the rules, and what we forget, we can easily look up. But I also scale the game up and down, and we scale the game up and down, sometimes depending on just how much time do we have to play. So it's a great way to kind of do that. Now, we've got that framework. This comes into the question of you're looking through the tech manuals, and you see this idea of quirks, design quirks, and you see sometimes they're listed. This was an older attempt to pull in some of the narrative, of these various mechs and give it some in-game mechanics. And these are alternate rules that sometimes will pull on the main rules, but it's more like an add-on where if you have this quirk, this type of thing happens. And depending on what that is, it could be an additional benefit like being able to fire 360 degrees around. It could be a negative. Some of the machines, they don't have the ability to torso twist with how they're designed. So what that means is you have to actually spend movement to turn and face. You see some machines that make ejection really difficult. Well, if I'm not playing in a campaign, that's okay. But if I am, that's a different story. Other machines might have a certain look or a certain reputation that allows them to modify opposing pilot skill checks. These quirks that are listed are completely optional. All the mechs have the core rules, but this is another way that you can pull in the design quirks and utilize it. How often do I play with them? Honestly, and I'd be curious about your feedback, my fellow mech warriors and my fellow mech commanders, we rarely play with them. Occasionally, once or twice in a campaign and pulling in some RPG aspects. It's another level of bookkeeping that I understand to pull in that flavor and narrative from the tech manuals, but I won't say there's anything super legendary or groundbreaking in there. It kind of reminds me of the role-playing system, GURPS, Generic Universal Role-Playing System, where you develop your character and you get a certain amount of, let's say, skills and abilities. But if you want more points to spend, you got to take some literally quirks. This idea that you take some negative stuff or some flawed stuff or just kind of personality traits that get you points to buy more stuff. It sounded really cool, but you'd want to get some of those extra, at least with the earlier editions of GURPS, you'd want to get some of those extra points for character development. So you'd come up with stuff like my character always has to have a deck of cards that they're flipping through and manipulating. Yeah, it sounds kind of cool. So I get +2 more skill points, or maybe even +1 points. Well, I want 10. So you come up with all these weird and wacky quirks that you never really remember anyway. And when you do, it kind of takes away from the game. So within that framework, I sometimes feel like playing with the design quirks, it's more to remember than it is necessarily to utilize. I can see it working in a smaller game for pulling in a narrative. If I'm kind of going on a narrative game with 4 other players. We did this once where we were part of a lance. Straight up Battletech rules. We were part of a lance, and we each had a mech that we were playing, and the GM, the player running the game, had some opposing forces and some missions set up, and they were trying to play that against us. So in that case, because we were pulling more in a narrative, we did play with it. I could see that. But that's where you see them. That's how they operate. In terms of usability, I'd love to get that feedback. Is that something that you all play with in your Battletech groups? Or is it just kind of there and it's kind of cool to read, but you never really utilize it in your games?